Welcome back. There's a cluster of traits and behaviours that reveal a leader's true values and establish the actual culture of a church. Culture in this context describes the accepted priorities, values and behaviours that create the character of a church. Now, this may seem a little abstract, so we'll illustrate with a story from our leadership archive. Once again, we disguise the identities of the church and the people involved.
The Reverend Coleman Hunt, not his real name, was obsessed with expository preaching. Let's get back to the book. It's the faithful exposition of Scripture that the church needs today, was his often repeated mantra, usually reinforced by a gentle tap on his Bible. Big gestures and histrionics were not Hunt's thing. More at home with books and people, he believed his calling was to encourage biblical literacy. He was a shy, introspective man, and public speaking and performance didn't come naturally to him. Never make the mistake of associating egoism and the desire to control with extroverts. Hunt hid ruthless ambition, a towering ego, and a ruthless determination to eliminate any rival who challenged his position or whose views contradicted his own behind a gentle, self-effacing persona. He guarded his pulpit and position as jealously as any medieval warlord guarded his castle against the threat of rivals or invaders. Only his vision and his vision alone ruled the church. He mistakenly believed his approach to be strong leadership rather than evidence of a deep-rooted insecurity. He had to be the one, and all others were either subordinates who served his vision or subversives who were best ignored and marginalized. Indeed, he boasted about this at pastors' fraternals and cited it as an example of strong, decisive leadership. Hunt was a poodle posing as a lion king. Yet as this story unfolds, you will learn that even poodles can bite. I admit, Hunt stretched my love to breaking point. Since the founding of Hunt's church, it had prioritized local evangelism and community action. Hunt paid lip service to the mission statement, but imposed his own career trajectory on the church. He steered the church away from local evangelism and turned it into a lecture theatre for his expository performances. The students from a neighbouring theological college found his sermons mildly stimulating. But for most local people, his teaching was about as relevant to their daily lives as a course in ancient Mesopotamian history. Precise exposition of the ancient text, but with little practical application. Hunt had big ideas about himself and was determined that his Bible teaching should have the widest possible audience. Consequently, he directed the church to invest in state-of-the-art broadcasting equipment and employ a small crew of media professionals. He purchased premium slots on Christian TV and used church resources to promote his teaching on social media. At this stage in his pastorate, it became very clear to the congregation which people and workers Hunt favoured. The value of congregants was not decided by their gift, Christian character, and godliness, or even their usefulness to the church, but by their acceptance and endorsement of Hunt's personal vision and their willingness to help him deliver it. Exploiting his position as the minister, Hunt had ditched the church's mission statement and replaced it with his own personal agenda. The biggest threat to Hunt's position and self-seeking agenda came from within the church itself. Dr. Maria Koska was a gifted evangelist and communicator with excellent team leadership skills. She had a PhD from St. Andrews and specialised in the gospel and popular culture. But her stress on local evangelism didn't fit with Hunt's agenda. Koska's emphasis, however, was in perfect harmony with the church's mission statement. Moreover, she had a track record in local evangelism and with her team had led many people to Christ, most of whom were now active church members. Hunt's agenda for a wider TV ministry had drawn resources away from local mission. In his attempt to build an international reputation as a Bible expositor, he had disconnected from local people. Opinion in his own congregation was divided. Some applauded the new direction, delighted that their pastor was a rising TV star. Others were concerned that the church was becoming irrelevant to the local community. All was not well in the kingdom of Hunt. He had intentionally redefined the mission of the church by redirecting most of its resources to Bible exposition and his own media exposure. Evangelism became the Cinderella of the church. Dr. Koska and those like her were loyal people and struggled on in the church, remaining true to the original mission statement that prioritized evangelism. Deprived of resources, they were deliberately sidelined and scandalously parodied as marketing people whose approach to the gospel of Christ and evangelism was shallow and cheapened the grace of God. By this time, Hunt had silenced almost all dissent in the church and ruled as an unrivaled monarch. He presented himself as the champion of the word and slyly insinuated that Koska had little spiritual and theological depth, a shallow person. This was a calumny. Koska was a more original and incisive thinker than Hunt, and was certainly a better communicator. As such, she became Hunt's Wicked Witch of the North. She and her cohort of evangelists and social activists were a threat to his position and ambitions. The solution was simple: starve them out. Ultimately, they had no alternative but to leave the church. Hunt gave a long sigh of relief. Thank goodness. The field was his at last, and there were no rivals in sight. Only a culled regiment of nodding sycophants. Sadly, Hunt's example and the enforcement of his priorities had dramatically changed the culture of the church and defined who was in and who was out.
The impact of a leader's behaviour is well documented. Edgar Schein, an authority on culture and leadership, observed characteristics and behaviours of leaders that impact their organisation. We've wrestled with Schein's material and asked the question, how relevant is this to the church? Are his observations theologically valid, or are we merely presenting a secular philosophy in a Christian guise? Our conclusion is that Schein, an astute observer and chronicler of human behaviour, has something to say to the church. Our experience of Christian leadership confirms many of his findings. We have been driven to conclude by repeated experience that rich seams of gold, that is, positive traits, and fault lines, that is, negative traits, in the church can be traced back to the leadership. Unless there is humility on the part of leaders and a willingness to self-reflect and change, a fault line can do long-term and even irreparable damage to a church and bury any seams of gold under the rubble. We're now going to examine 5 leadership behaviours. And it's imperative that leaders are sufficiently self-aware to see how they play out in their own leadership. With constant surveillance, these behaviours can become seams of gold that enrich the church. Now, when answering the questions in each section, we recommend that you involve a trusted friend who has seen you operate in leadership and will comment honestly on your answers. The first trait we'll look at is the leader's allocation of resources. The proof of a leader's priorities, that's what's really important to them, can be measured by his or her allocation of time, resources, personnel, and the distribution of money. As we've seen in the story, the stated priority is community evangelism, but little money is directed towards it. Instead, the pastor's true priority is the promotion of his ministry as a Bible teacher. Consequently, he invests money in state-of-the-art media technology. When projects are out of sync with the stated values and priorities of the church, it opens a rift, a fault line, that sends a strong message to the congregation. Their priorities and actions must align with those of the leader. Members with ministries that fail to advance the leader's priorities and goals are often marginalised, under-resourced, and their contributions overlooked. This was the experience of Maria Koska and her team. The situation is reinforced by a false paradigm that relies more on church tradition than scripture. That is, the vision and goals of the local church are set by the leader alone, and everyone else must follow. As we've already noted, the leader must be a servant. The church is not the leader's fiefdom, but Christ's living body under his rule and tutelage. As such, Christ directs his body through the gifts and ministries of the many and not the one. Therefore, the use of resources should not reflect the ambition of the leader, but the Father's equipping of the saints for works of ministry and the application of biblical priorities. This approach, facilitated by the servant leader, utilises the discernment, spiritual wisdom, gifts and experience of the congregation. Wisely distributed resources can be a critical element in the growth and unity of the church, a seam of gold. A servant leader needs to consider the effect that a change in allocated resources will have on the affected people. Let's apply this to ourselves with the help of the following questions. What does your allocation of resources tell others about your true values? Then assess the relationship between your true values and the stated values of the church. How closely are they aligned? Now review the initiatives you promote and consider the impact of your choices on people in the church. What do you learn from this? The second trait we'll look at is the people the leader favours. The type of person a leader recruits and rewards reinforces the culture of a church. It is well attested that people gravitate to others like themselves. Consequently, leaders have a tendency, deliberate or unconscious, to favour people of similar background, character, outlook, values and ethnicity to themselves. This stamps the leader's image on the church. To understand this, we'll use the analogy of a singer. The singer is a baritone and only auditions baritones for his backing vocalists. If a vocalist is not a baritone, however talented, he is confronted with a dilemma. Should he be true to himself and his gifts, sing bass and risk exclusion? Or should he conform, take a few lessons from a voice coach and try to sing baritone? In order to be accepted in a culture where baritones rule, sopranos, bass and tenors do their best to become baritones. This unwitting tendency to choose people like us is understandable. It reduces the chance of personality clashes, challenges to authority, and disagreements over theology and strategy. Uniformity is often confused with true Christian unity. Gifted and mature men and women of God who do not conform to type can be excluded. Only baritones are welcome. Domineering leaders will deliberately follow this path, regarding dissent as an obstacle to their goals and vision. Let us insert a warning. This trait is a dangerous fault line. When baritones alone are acceptable, the rich diversity of voices is lost. Professor Scott Page, a world-renowned authority on team behaviour, has statistically analysed teams and shown that diversity is a critical factor in their success. The evidence proves that a diverse team is far more effective. In the language of our analogy, a vocal ensemble that comprises the entire tonal range is infinitely better than one with baritones alone. The principle of preferring people like us is also reflected in the leader's recognition and reward of members. The rewards can be quite subtle. People with an acceptable profile will be publicly acknowledged and affirmed. This is toxic, encouraging nepotism and the rejection of those who fail to conform to type. The scriptural model is radically different. Diversity is celebrated in the New Testament. We enter a new kingdom in which unity is expressed in glorious diversity. Bass, sopranos, tenors and baritones are all celebrated and welcomed. Take a moment to reflect on the things we have just discussed and consider the following questions. Do you choose people because of their conformity to your views and values or their capability? Do you prefer to work with people of a similar personality type to you? Give your reasons. What do you learn about yourself from the people you choose, affirm and reward? And reflect on the people you choose, affirm and reward. How do your choices affect the church? The next trait we'll look at is the things that command a leader's attention. A leader's values and what he or she prioritises are trumpeted by the emphasis and attention given to them. The church responds by focusing on these, and they become embedded in its culture. The effect is inevitable and can have either a negative or a positive outcome. In the story, Hunt publicly broadcasts his priorities by focusing on expository preaching and his media presence. In contrast, another church leader may trumpet his priorities by regularly meeting with the leaders of his preferred ministries and activities and ignoring others. This sends a clear message. These are the things that require the attention and effort of the church. A potential fault line is caused when the leader's personal objectives and values are made the church's top priority. Unity is understood in terms of the willingness of members to sing the leader's song. This sets a very harmful and unscriptural precedent with destructive repercussions. All songs are muted except the leader's own. In the story, all Hunt's attention was diverted to his personal goals. Evangelism and Maria Koska, the evangelist, were dismissed as of no value. Hunt was determined that his song and his song alone should define his church. Positively, this dynamic becomes a seam of gold when the leader deliberately highlights and reinforces ministries that advance the agreed direction of the church. This is illustrated by another story from our archive. Identities are again disguised.
Pastor Jonathan Patterson, not his real name, became the pastor of the City Temple, a failing city centre church in the north of England. The vision of the church to reach a city had been lost, and it was drifting without purpose, like a ship without a rudder. Leaders and members were utterly demoralised. Patterson, a man of God, as well as a strategic thinker, recognised that without co-workers he could do very little. Consequently, he set himself to revive the leadership and create a dynamic, synergistic team. The City Temple's mission statement was formulated in the church's glory days. Patterson was not motivated by personal ambition and made the mission statement his mandate. It prioritised evangelism, biblical discipleship, fellowship, responsible pastoral care, and the nurturing of young converts in the Christian faith. Secure enough in himself to recognise that he had no monopoly on ministry gifts, Patterson deliberately encouraged key ministries in the church, even those in which he was not directly involved. His presence and interest trumpeted their importance and sent morale through the roof. He loved his leaders, and they thought the world of him. As a consequence, the ministry teams felt valued and empowered, and buzzed with energy and purpose. The church flourished. Soon, a failing, directionless church had been transformed into a dazzling lighthouse for the city. When local people talked about the church, they only meant one church, the City Temple. The church had impacted the entire urban community.
In our experience, leaders rarely think about the impact on the church of the things they favour and to which they pay attention. The following questions will help you reflect on this and identify the things you pay attention to and the influence this has on your church or organisation. Describe in your own words the behavioural differences between the leader's attention to favoured ministries and the application of resources to them. What effect does each have on the church? In the context of your church or ministry, what do you value and personally prioritise? What effect does this have on those you lead? And on what basis do you decide which ministries and activities are worthy of your attention? What effect does this have on those concerned and the wider congregation? After answering these questions, Are there any changes you need to make? What is your action plan? The fourth aspect we'll look at are the things the leader models and teaches. A leader's example is critically important because it conveys their actual values regardless of what they claim. Indeed, values are not ornaments displayed in an antiques cabinet, but are fleshed out in the nitty-gritty of daily life. When stated values are not reflected in the leader's behaviour, people ignore their instructions and choose instead to follow their example. What we model, therefore, has a greater impact on the church than what we say. A disconnect between word and action undermines a leader's integrity and authority. It broadcasts, "My words don't really matter. As your leader, I'll do as I please." This is often a subliminal message, but not always. One leader known to us confessed, "As the pastor of the church, I shouldn't be governed by the rules I make for my members. I should be free to do what I want." He believed that his role as leader permitted him to transcend any accountability for his actions and was blind to the practical and spiritual consequences. Sadly, during 50 years of ministry, we have seen variations of this attitude used to justify everything from sexual promiscuity to despotic nepotism. Double standards result in a confused and discordant church. Faced with such leadership inconsistency, people react in different ways. Some deliberately choose to ignore the pastor's inconsistencies. This is often justified by an argument lifted from the Israelite monarchy. The king was regarded as the Lord's anointed, and therefore the representative of God's rule and authority. The role of the pastor is understood in similar terms. So, to question the pastor, therefore, is regarded as an act of rebellion. A variation on this argument is that the pastor is the appointed leader and the church should submit uncritically. Others will use the leader's behaviour as an excuse for misconduct. The pastor does it, so do I. Yet others, aware of the leader's inconsistencies, will cut their own path by applying their own values. This is where the application of Shine's secular principles and those of many leadership gurus break down. In the church, the human leader is not the primary model. Christ is the head, and his example and teaching allow us to distinguish seams of gold from fault lines. Consequently, the leader's example shouldn't have the same force in the church as it does in secular organisations. Jesus and his word are our chief guide. We follow in his footsteps. It is his song and his song alone that should set the culture of the church. Have you ever considered the impact of your example on those you lead? The following questions will help you address this challenge. Does your behaviour align with your publicly stated values? How do members of your church react to your example? Give examples. And how can you ensure your behaviour and stated values are aligned? What steps will you take? How can you introduce accountability to help you maintain your alignment between your stated values and behaviour? Lastly, we will consider the leader's response to critical incidents. In normal circumstances, Our behaviour is a fairly reliable guide to our adopted values, but our true values are often exposed during critical incidents. In crisis, we react reflexively without consideration. These are called moments of truth. A biblical example of this is Peter's reaction when interrogated by a servant girl after Jesus' arrest. Hours earlier, he had vowed never to publicly disown Jesus. Yet, when challenged by the girl about his association with him, he denied any knowledge of his Lord. What was happening here? His avowal of loyalty to Jesus was sincere and well meant. He embraced fully the value of loyalty and was distressed when Jesus predicted his denial. Yet, when threatened with exposure as a follower of Jesus, his reflexive reaction overrode his stated value. Self-preservation was a more compelling value than sacrificial loyalty. This was his moment of truth, the moment when Peter met himself. A word of caution. Moments of truth need to be distinguished from the emotional trauma triggered, for example, by personal tragedy. The person who receives news of the sudden death of a loved one will react dramatically. It's a bomb that detonates intense emotional trauma. The ensuing emotional volatility is not an expression of values, but the natural reaction to pain and loss. Values are often the clothes that we wear to make us acceptable to our peer group. As such, they are disposable and easily exchanged, depending upon the company we keep. In the church, there are behaviours that are considered normal, even if they reflect cultural rather than scriptural preferences. In such circumstances, values can be determined by church etiquette, and there is a subtle pressure to conform. Moments of truth strip away these superficial clothes and expose the leader's true self and motivations. Therefore, they can provide a more reliable guide to the true values of a leader than his or her conduct in less stressful circumstances. Repeated moments of truth focus and magnify any disparity between the leader's stated values and behaviour. The response of the leader at such times can be the example that others will follow. Actions speak louder than words. It is important to learn from our experience. What do we learn about ourselves from our moments of truth? It's easy to dismiss them without drawing out the lessons they teach about ourselves and our values. The following questions will help you rise to this challenge. Reflect on your moment of truth experiences and record what they tell you about your true values. Our seams of gold and fault lines are publicly exposed during these critical moments. If the true measure of a person is revealed in times of crisis, how can we ensure that it is only seams of gold that are displayed? This question will involve serious prayer and self-reflection. Two supplementary questions are vital in this exercise. Do your values accord with Scripture and the teaching and example of Jesus? And how can we turn these values into ones which will transform us inwardly and change our reactions? Write down your responses and discuss them with your trusted friend. Welcome back. The 5 spheres of a leader's influence we have highlighted can either be seams of gold or fault lines. Our style of leadership should be a glittering seam of gold, reflecting Christ's servant-hearted character. Such leaders will inevitably transform the ethos and atmosphere of a church. To truly benefit from this session, we recommend that you memorise the 5 behaviours and record what you've learnt about yourself. Use them frequently as a checklist to review your leadership style. It's important to note that these are not the only characteristics of a servant-hearted leader. We have some way to travel yet. In the next session, we will look more deeply into the servant-hearted character of Jesus. In preparation, please read and reflect on Philippians 2, verses 3 to 11. And we'll see you next time.